All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, here's that promised video on that strange word in Daniel 6:18. Interestingly enough, when Gesenius discusses it, he says Daniel 6:19. Now, those kinds of errors happen, from time to time, and you just overlook those. But it just shows you that that's another thing that you've got to be wary of as you do this type of research. Let me welcome you all as you come in. This is going to be a subject that few Bible scholars, few, if any, preachers or pastors or priests or anybody covers, because as I've long explained, this man-woman relationship is something that has brought a lot of disinformation along with it for various purposes, misinformation, outright lies. It's a control issue. It has been since day one. And although God, and I'm not really speaking for him so much now as I'm looking across the corpus of scripture and other ancient writings, and even watching what happens currently and throwing all of that into this pot and stirring it up and trying to figure out what's going on here. The control that the powers that be have exerted over us in our private relationships began with this situation between men and women. And because of the choices, if you read Genesis the way that I do, I'll put it that way because I'm not going to force this entire subject that I covered today on everybody. I just want to make you aware of it. If you look at what happened in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, there's obviously some type of transition that occurs. And the restrictions between the sexes don't exist until then. I mean, as far as what rules they need to abide by in this particular phase of existence, and for how long and under what circumstances those controls and those restrictions apply. As I've long said, my view on this entire thing is so much different than anybody else that this is going to offend some people, it's going to shock others, it's going to confuse people. Just approach it with an open mind and look at what I present to you and make up your own mind about it. Bottom line, however, are those first two commandments, the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, might, mind, and strength. And the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. And these two are all the law and the prophets. So what God expects is responsibility. He's not prudish, as I've long said. The restrictions on women in particular are such that they've been, Jesus said it once, at least he's quoted with saying it. The woman in adultery was brought to him. And they said, she was caught, the people that got her, primarily the priests, and there were some other Sadducees that were there, and Pharisees said, she was caught in the very act, and I've talked about this before, so you need to stone her, so pick up a stone and stone her. And the interesting thing here is, why did they come to Jesus? Just merely to confront him with this question? And why was it that they were telling him to cast the stone? Well, if your wife is caught in adultery with another man, basically two things happen. One, both the man and the woman, let me rephrase that, both the woman and the man are brought before the elders and before the husband. And it's the husband's decision whether or not to cast the first stone at his wife and the man that violated his marriage contract with that woman. Do you understand what I'm telling you here? So again, there were two reasons they brought this woman to Jesus. First of all, to catch him in the law, obviously, and the second was because he actually was most likely the husband of this woman that was brought to him. The other thing is notice that the law says that if they're caught in the act, that both the man and the woman are brought. Only the woman was brought to Jesus. Where's the man who was guilty of this if they were caught in the very act? You notice something wrong here? coffee. That's going to get cold because I'm not going to be drinking it now for a while. I want to concentrate on this. Those are just some of the issues. I'm not going to spell it all out here. I'm not going to explain why Jesus did what he did there, if in fact that's the way it happened, and I think it probably did. Although some people say that entire episode was added to the Gospels later for various reasons. However, I think that it's still indicative of some insight as to what's happened to us. Again, God requires responsibility. He doesn't care how we have these social interactions. I mean, there are restrictions. And again, I have to be somewhat careful about how I say this, but certainly the situation between two men and even two women is something that's not, well, between two men is considered a mortal sin. Okay, between two women is not really even mentioned anywhere in the scriptures, but it's not healthy for that because they don't fulfill the purpose of their creation. But we're not going to go there today. I'm just throwing some of this stuff out so you can see how deeply I've looked into this and how I understand it. So, as you know, there's an issue of what the relationship was between men and women prior to the fall. And I've talked about that before. Only after the fall was Eve told that that her desire would be to her husband and he would rule over her, and that her sorrow in her conception would be greatly multiplied. Well, what was the situation before that? And that's kind of what we're going to look at today. And in what regard do we follow the situation that it was, as we understand it today, about this one man, one woman thing? What is that? Where did that come from? And why is it pressed? And still, even at that, in many religions, especially in the Christian cultures, it's considered a dirty thing that, you just do it because you just have to procreate, and it's just a necessary evil. And that's totally wrong. That's totally wrong. That's an intrinsic part of that man-woman relationship. And it only changed as far as the restrictions were concerned after the fall. And I read between the lines here. Like I said, some of this is going to shock a lot of you. Okay, and it goes back again also to some things that Jesus said that have been misinterpreted. But I'm just going to hold off on all of that. We're going to talk about this today and why it's so important to understand this problem that happens in Daniel. So let me read the verse that we're talking about in Daniel. Then I'm going to give you a little history about Daniel and the book of Daniel, which some of you are not going to like, okay, just the way it is. But that's just the fact of the historical situation. Not saying it doesn't have merit, but let's go ahead and read it. So we're going to go to Daniel 6:18. And even Gesenius makes a mistake here, and when he explains this word, he says it's Daniel 6:19. Throws a lot of people off. But anyway, let me read this to you. Daniel 6, book of Daniel 6:18. Chapter 6, verse 18. Then, the background of this is some of Daniel's opponents have worked up this little thing where they make it so that if anybody prays to the God of Israel or basically doesn't bow down to the king's statue, that they'll be thrown into the fire or to the lion's den. In other words, executed. And Darius, who was the king at this time, and there's a problem with his name, which I'll explain in a minute, but he loves Daniel. He doesn't realize that this is a setup to get rid of Daniel, his chief advisor. And so when these accusations are made, being the king, he has to follow through with his own law. So he throws Daniel in this lion's den, but he's lamenting. He's very emotionally and spiritually upset about it. And he can't sleep at night. He doesn't want any comfort because he's done this thing to his great friend. Okay, so that's the background. That's what we're looking at here, and this is what this verse 18 says. Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Fasting, very important part of this entire passage and what's really going on here. Neither were instruments of music brought before him. And that's the issue that we're talking about here with this word right here. This word right here. And his sleep went from him. the word that they translate into musical instruments for whatever reason. And this is even to some extent in the Hebrew version as well. If you go to the Hebrew lexicon or any Hebrew translation, it's going to use this word, the kavah. Is it really musical instruments? And why would it not be explained as what it really is? So that's what we're going to talk about. And I'm not saying that I have a definitive answer for this. And even if I did, I still think that you need to investigate this, because this goes again to the very core of our men and women relationships and what God really expects. And you'll see some diversions from the standard traditional viewpoint of one man, one woman. And I understand that that's troubling. And Michael Heiser, for instance, who I have a lot of respect for, would say, well, you can't always look at what the ancients did and apply it to what the Gospels or what the Gospel requires of us, because, that was a different culture. It's moving through some different things. You can't always take the examples of those. You have to go back to the situation in Eden. Well, that's what I am doing. And Michael Heiser would disagree with me on that, and I understand it. But what was the situation in Eden? Was it one man, one woman only? It talks about God creating male and female together, right? But what's the expanse of that? What's really going on? And why did God say that curse to Eve that seems so odd considering what we all think Eden was? I am not promoting promiscuity. I'm not promoting adultery, or even what you might consider to be fornication, which really isn't just unmarried promiscuity. It's really not that. And we'll probably touch on that today. This class is going to be extensive. I should probably break it down into several different categories, but I'm just going to go with it as it is here now, okay? So let's continue on. So what is this kavah right here? Remember what I told you. I said, look at this word. Those of you who followed me and have gone along with the Hebrew study should recognize that there's a word right here that's right inside the word kavah. And I asked some people if they could see what it was, but it's not fair for me to do that to you. Let me show you what that word is. It's right here. It's going to be in red. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but I'll point to it too. That word right there. Chava, Eve. The very word, the very name of Eve is in the kavah. Now there will be Hebrew and Aramaic scholars that'll say, Roy, no, it's the root word is dakah, and Gesenius talks about it right before this word, as does Strong's, and it means to thrust down. Well, that's still not a musical instrument. And then they try to explain, well, what it means by that, the root word dakah, is that it's strumming. You're strumming the musical instruments. Okay, well, what about the horned instruments? All right, not just the harps and the stringed instruments they had at the time, which I can't remember the name of right now. But the point is, it really doesn't fit, especially since it talks about Darius was fasting. Problem here. Why did they change? Why do they say this is musical instruments? And we're going to talk about that. Let me get back to Daniel. Daniel in Hebrew means God's judge, or the judge of God, not meaning he's judging God, but that God has put him in a position to judge, okay? Darius, as I started to say, is actually, apparently, historically, we can't really find that individual. It basically is probably Cyrus, the Persian, but regardless, Darius is probably just nothing more than an office name, sort of like Caesar or King or that type of thing. Darius just means basically the one with great resources, kind of thing, like that. So Darius, that's been a subject in the scholarly circles, historian circles for a long time, well, they can't find this Darius guy, and there have been all kinds of explanations of it, and that's just the one I've settled on, and I'm backed up by that, with that idea by many, not everybody, but I think Darius is probably, first of all, probably an office, like I said, Caesar or king or even Messiah, Mashiach. Those are all offices, not necessarily an individual. But there's a problem in Daniel generally. Most people think that Daniel was written during the Babylonian captivity, under Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and then moving over to the Persians under Darius, and etc. But really, it's pretty hard to prove that. The fact of the matter is, it looks like Daniel was probably written, the book Daniel was probably actually written during the Seleucid, the Greek occupation of Palestine in about 150 BC. A lot of reasons for that in Daniel. I won't go into them, but just one example is the dining methods of the royalty that are mentioned in Daniel don't fit the Babylonian time frame. It fits the Seleucid time frame. That's just one example. And we see these things also with the Dead Sea Scrolls, between whether they were written during the Seleucid and Maccabean period, or whether they were written during the Roman period. And actually they're split right there, that we have both of them, which I have talked about and Eisenman has talked about, which is why those Psalms that I've talked about over the last few days are so important. Even though they're in the Dead Sea Scrolls, those things are during the time of Jesus, who you would know as Jesus' life, that man. So the background of Daniel is, it probably wasn't written during the Babylonian captivity. Many pseudepigrapha are in the Bible, especially in the New Testament. But Daniel is probably, it's being written because, and think about it from this historical and military point of view. You're a Jew, you're one of the Israelites that are left, all right, in there, and the Greeks come in and they've taken over, and they've ransacked the temple, and they've stolen things, they're persecuting you and all that, and you want to talk about them being defeated at some point. Are you going to write, down, we're going to massacre you, Antiochus Epiphanes, who we're talking about here, the Seleucid king, we're going to destroy your armies, everybody rise up, No, you're not going to do that, because the next thing you're going to do is you're going to get executed. So what do? You write a story about it, prophetic or otherwise, and you frame it in a time period far removed from your persecutors, from those who are occupying your land and have stolen your thrones. That's what you do. And that's exactly what's going on here. And as we've often talked about, I'm sorry, coffee, I don't know why it makes me burp. The situation in Daniel is that kind of a situation. And Daniel is used primarily by those late Judites and early Christians. They're quoting it all the time because it's really about their time period. It's preterism to a high degree, more so than the book of Revelation. Most of Daniel, although there's some bleed over there is. You can say it's God giving whoever wrote Daniel inspiration, and I'd accept that. But it's primarily what's happening in the 150 BC to 70 AD time period, up through the fall of the temple. That's what it is. It's extensively quoted in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's even quoted, of course, in the New Testament, specifically in Revelation, at least the concepts, as well as Ezekiel. Those are quoted quite a bit as well. But at any rate, and of course, Enoch and all the others. But these things were written for those people in that time, although I do believe that God has put some things in there that apply to our day. For instance, in the book of Revelation, as you know, there's the idea of pharmakia, and that the men of the world have deceived the whole world through their pharmakia, their sorceries, their drugs, right? Well, that didn't really apply in those days. I mean, there are people that could argue, well, it's Caesar's sorcery to take over the world or whatever. No, we're talking about something pretty concrete here. So, there's evidence there that the Revelation applies to our day, at least that portion of it. And as Michael Heiser points out, And I have long explained, you can't look at the Bible, even the book of the Bible, like the book of Revelation, or Daniel for that matter, or Ezekiel, any of those. You can't look at them in chronological order because Middle Eastern thought is circular. And often they'll come back in their prophecies to a certain thing, and you're saying, well, didn't he just talk about that? Or in some other form. Yeah, he did. That's exactly right. So you can't look at it from a linear point of view. You have to look at it from a circular. I've talked about all that before. Okay, well, that background, now you know that Daniel was probably not written during the Babylonian captivity, which would explain this thing with Darius being out of place, and also some of the cultural things that we see supposedly that Daniel was talking about in the Babylonian time period and the Persian. And now we know that these were Seleucid things. Again, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, when Dr. Heisman and I explained that many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written actually during the time period from Jesus' birth up through the destruction of the temple, and maybe even shortly thereafter. The way we know that is by what's in the text. The Romans worshiped their standards of war as gods. If you didn't know that, you need to read Eisenman's works and listen to my lectures on the Eisenman series and other things here in the religion series. The Seleucids didn't do that. Another internal thing in the text that shows the time frame, rather than trying to push everything back into the Maccabean time period so that you don't have to address these issues and cover up and reveal that you've been covering up things and lying to us for 2,000 years. Okay, that's an example. Another thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the marriage arrangements of the Herodians. The Seleucids didn't, I should say the Maccabees. The Maccabees didn't do that. Okay, the Maccabees. All right. The Maccabees didn't have those types of, they were very strict actually in their interpretation of the laws. The Herodians, however, that's another indication that the Herodians is a time period that a lot of those Dead Sea Scrolls are applying. And I've talked about all this before. That's all as part of an introduction. So here we are. Roy, well, who are you to say that this Aramaic, which is really what this is, Daniel's broken up into several areas, and there are reasons for that too, because it was probably written at different times. And of course, as I pointed out before, sometimes the words that are chosen are used to hide deeper meanings, and I'm not going to get into that too much, but in Daniel it's written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. Chapter 1 is basically Hebrew, then 2 through 8, or 2 through 7, 2 through 8, right in there, are basically in Aramaic, and then the rest are in Hebrew. Well, why did they do that? So I'm giving it to the scholars that, yeah, this could be the Aramaic version of something about thrusting down. It could be, but I don't think so, because it talks about Darius fasting, or whoever this is, fasting. And one of the things you do when you fast is, music isn't really something that you fast from. It depends on what the music is. But it would be from conjugal relationships. It's one of the things you fast for, not because they're evil, but because you're trying to focus all of your attention on God. Okay, and God, and there are some people will not like what I'm going to say here either. But in fact, the marriage coming together, the conjugal relationship, is actually required prior to approaching God. That's another thing. People say, well, that's satanic. No, it's not. The Satanists just copy it and use it for their own purposes. But anyway, because it's the coming together of the image of God. All right, so without all that background, let's talk about it. Chava. What's happening here? Why did they translate it into musical instruments? And it's even that way in the interlinear Bible, okay, in the Hebrew extant translations. But I pointed out that there are 4 levels of meaning in Hebrew, and that applies to Aramaic to some extent as well, certainly in this case. These 4 levels are pardes, PRDS, and I won't give you all that, what those mean or whatever. That would take too long to go through it. But basically you have a literal interpretation, like if it says door, it really means door. Or the esoteric meaning. Door meaning it's a gateway into a kingdom of God, that kind of thing. So there are different levels of meaning. And that's really what's happening here. Why whoever wrote Daniel did this way, I can't answer for that, although I suspect it had something to do with honoring what Darius did for Daniel, at least in the story. And probably hiding the fact that potential enemies would have posterity from that line. Okay, this is all going to be pretty deep. So let's go to Gesenius and see what happens here. If you go to Strong's and you look this up, this word 1760, and there'll be a little note there that says it comes from 1760, which is the one I'm talking about, the caw, which is to thrust down. Do you thrust down a musical instrument? They say, well, it means like playing. Well, this is one of those errors that Strong's and even some of the scholars make, whether intentionally or because they're trying to hide this issue that I'm going to get to right here, which is, again, another aspect of the male-female relationship. There are wives and there are concubines, and they're both legitimate under God's law. Let's just put it that way. 1760? No. You look at that and it just doesn't fit. Because there are some musical instruments that you don't thrust down. You know, the wind instruments refer to the flutes, the horns and things like that. So it doesn't really work. All right? And you have to look at this, like I said, these things are historical, and you've got to look at the situation as they are historically. So let's see. I've already shown you here that the name for Eve, the first woman, is right in the word. Why would that be? Let's read what Gesenius says. Okay, so this is Gesenius. It is a Hebrew lexicon, and you can see, I think, I'm on this page here, and the word that we're going to look at is this one right here. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. Let's see if I can bring that in. Right there where that finger, that word right there, and up above it is that word daka, which means to thrust down. Okay, but did they really just insert a vav in there because it's Aramaic? As I showed you in a class some time ago, Isaiah would add a word. For instance, in the name of Cyrus, Koresh. One time he uses a vav, and one time he doesn't. He's telling you something. And in this case, they're telling us something, okay? So let's read what he says about this word. Daka va. Again, it's translated as a musical instruments, that Darius didn't want to have musical instruments in his room. Who would he want in his room? Who would they really want to not probably have in there? Who would he probably not have in there? He would probably be alone, away from his concubines. Well, that's exactly what Gesenius says here. Let's read it. Dakava is Chaldean, it's Aramaic, a concubine. And it does come from Daka, all right, which I've explained, 1760, okay? At least that's what he says. But that it may come from Daka. But he definitely says it's a concubine. But then he makes some other statements here. And he says, first of all, he says it's in Daniel 6:19, and it's not. It's in Daniel 6:18. So there's a throw off right there. And these little errors happen from time to time. Daniel 6:19 is what he should have said. And then he has it written out there. And he says, and this is how he translates it, nor did he allow concubines to be brought to him. Not musical instruments. But there's some disagreements on that, and he talks about these disagreements. He says, Theodote and the Syriac arbitrarily interpret it food. See, he knows better. The Hebrew interpreters were a little better with musical instruments, especially such as were struck. That's where the word daka comes from, which is word 1760, struck. Well, you don't strike all musical instruments. That's a stretch. So this is why I said that this is an important issue. And why did Daniel do this? I can't definitively answer that, but I think I can definitively say that Darius wasn't concerned about not having musical instruments in his bedroom, in his throne bedroom, keeping these concubines away. But why did they turn it to musical instruments? Again, it had something to do with the situation with the Seleucid Greeks. It was quite common that one of the things that would happen during these conquerings of the Jews and the Israelites generally was one of the first things that would be inhibited would be their marriage arrangements. So why would you include information on this type of marriage arrangement and it is a concubine is a type of a marriage, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. It's not the same. It doesn't have the same responsibilities or the same punishments for violating it as an actual marriage does, an actual marriage contract. A concubinage contract is much more open. I don't mean an open marriage, open relationship, but it could even get to that too. But at any rate, you're basically trying to just avoid the issue so that they don't come looking for any potential posterity to kill off because of their rights to the throne or whatever. That's probably the most reasonable explanation of what's happening here. Chava, the name of the first woman, and she was only given that name after the fall. Isn't that interesting? Adam called his wife's name Eve, for she is the mother of all living. Chava means concubine. It's exactly what it means. It doesn't mean musical instruments, even in the Aramaic. It doesn't. Let's look at some other things, and I know this is a difficult subject. You have all these ideas about and family relationships. I was in plural marriage. I never had a concubine. Well, maybe I did. Some of those would probably be defined as that now that I look back. But a marriage is a contract that you can't violate or you commit adultery. You don't adulterate the woman or the man. You adulterate the contract, the vow that has been made. That's what real adultery is, and we'll get into that in a little bit in my notes here. But that's an actual marriage contract. And the wife has certain legal rights and responsibilities that a concubine doesn't have. By agreement, okay? These are concubines are women that want this relationship, these relationships, but not to be bound by legal restrictions to them or things that they have to do that maybe they don't want to agree to. And God made provision for that. And people say, no, it's one man, one woman. Well, let's just say again that the Bible, those things that happen after Eden are social constructs of some sort, or just God just allowed it because of the situation that's going on. Well, then you're saying that God changes. And you really don't understand what Eden was like before the fall. And I've already explained that with the curse on Eve, okay? So, a concubine is perfectly legitimate as long as they agree to it. And it is a contract of sorts. It can be for a short period of time, or it can be for life. It just depends. But the position of the rights of the woman are lesser. And we see that even today. There are people that are married, legally married, which, by the way, legal marriage didn't come into existence until 1890 when they were trying to control miscegenation. In other words, the marriages or the relationships between the races, say a black man and a white woman, they wanted to license those. Well, then when they started doing that, they go, wow, this is a great way to control the people. Let's make everybody get a license, and it was that way for a long time. But that's really not the program. That's really not the program. All right, let's go to some other things here. I think I've given you a background on Daniel, and that it's probably a type of pseudepigrapha. It was very likely not written during the Babylonian captivity. I'm not saying that there weren't some parchments or something that gave some information for the writers later to use it. The name Daniel is probably not a real individual. Just like I'm telling you that some of the writers of the New Testament, they aren't really Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, maybe Luke, but not Matthew and Mark, for instance. Not the real apostles. But all that's just further information to show you that you have to look at these things from historical and cultural perspective and language perspective, not just what you're told in Sunday school every day. That's a good start. Sunday school is a good place to start. But we're supposed to grow up and look at things as adults and not stay as children. And even Paul said that. As much as I dislike Paul, he said, at some point I have to put away childhood things. Yeah, that's true. And Isaiah talked about giving meat to them and not just milk, right? All right, so let's go through this, and I have to put my glasses on. You'll have to pardon me. I can't even read my own handwriting sometimes. I'm not going to write everything that I got down on my notes up on the board. But again, what we're going to is the importance of man-woman relationships and the efforts that have been to try to stifle that, and what we're seeing today with all the attacks. And I could list all of them, but you got to understand that if I did that here, this video would probably not be up very long. So you should understand what's going on in the world today, what's happening with CRT, for instance, with WOKE movement, with all of that. All right, with surgical transformation, which doesn't change anybody, it just removes organs that they were born with. You see those types of things? It's all going on. It's evil. It's evil, ladies and gentlemen. It's called calling evil good and good evil. All right, let's show some reasons why this cannot be musical instruments. The scholars are going to hate me for this, and they're going to come back and say, yeah. Sorry, I think it's pretty manifestly obvious, prima facie. For music, the normal words, and you can look these up, for music are these that are listed here. This is all in Strong's on the Hebrew side. 7892, 7705, 5329, and 2170. Wow. Well, this first one is shir, or shirah for the feminine. All right. Then you've got 7705, which is shiddah. Then you've got, and that can also, I might add, could be mistress of the house, because she's, probably singing, the mistress of the house can do what she wants, right? 5329 is the real word for musician. It's notzak. And then we have this word 2170 for music, which is zamor. Zamor. Do any of those sound like dakava? No. Why, if they meant musical instruments, why didn't they just use some form of these? Oh, it's because of the Aramaic. Well, I could have done that with these. No, they're telling you something that's going on here in secret. That's what's happening. A lot of this history is now hidden from us. It's been changed, altered, so we can't really get to the real issues. But there's no question that the king, or this person, that this allegorical story, it's about a real person, and they're hiding their posterity from the Seleucids. That's really what it's about. Okay. I might add here, I'm gonna throw another rock at the LDS. The LDS the Mormon Church has supported this move in Congress, in the Senate and the Congress, basically, to support and codify same-sex marriage. We're going down this road, ladies and gentlemen. Like Isaiah said, their sin is as Sodom, they hide it not. And sodomy isn't between men and women. Okay? It just isn't. I'm sorry, ladies, you prudish ladies and gentlemen think that God is concerned about how you make love to your spouse. That's not an issue. It's the thing between men and men. But at any rate, even Chuck Baldwin talks about that. He's pretty open about what that is really about. But they have gone along with this, and they made a statement, and they said, but the church's stance is still that marriage is about one man and one woman, but we're going to support this. Well, I hate to tell you, but they're going to go for it because they will lose their 501c3 tax exempt status if they don't. So so you Mormons, this is the hill to die on. The church has chosen to make government their God and to violate the very nature of the man-woman relationship themselves, after all these years of saying otherwise. So that's going to change. And that, yeah, they'll even be doing sealings in the temple. They'll have to, or they're going to face losing their tax-exempt status and probably some other punitive measures and lots of lawsuits. Watch. It's going to happen. They won't stand up for the truth. See, Mormons got to rethink who these people are that are up on 47 East South Temple. Okay, well, let's talk about, we see the music. Let's look at some other words for concubine, okay? The first one I'm going to mention here is word 6370 in the Hebrew side of Strong's, and it's pilegesh. Pilegesh. Now, as I've often said, you can understand more about what these words are by breaking them down by their letters, because each letter has a different meaning. So you can look at that and you can look into it and see more of what it means. Okay, we'll probably do that for you here in a minute, but I want to get through this. So pilegesh, it's Pei, Yod, Lamed, Gimel, Shin. Okay, pilegesh. And it basically means concubine. That's what it is. And there's another word that's often used. It's 3904, and that's lekena. Lekena, Lamed, Chet, Nun, He. Those are the ones that are most frequently used. This is actually, in this form, is only seen in one place in the Bible, and that's in this Daniel 6:18. Which, again, like Isaiah, only place he misspelled Cyrus, Koresh, was one time. Why did he do that? Well, they're sending a message, and that's, again, what's happening here. So they could have used the word concubines here, but for some reason they chose not to, probably to protect someone. Remember, these are military operations, and I recognize that because I was a military officer. I see these things, and even in the Bible and how things work there, okay? So those are the two words for concubine that could be used. Now, some people say, no, concubines are prostitutes. Hold on. No, they're not. The words for prostitute are 2490. And you'll notice something about this. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a Chet, Lamed, Lamed. Whenever you see two Lameds together, that means you better pay attention because you can't do this. A Chet is a wall or a fence. So basically, a prostitute is somebody that if you go with, it's prohibited very, very strongly. Chet is a wall. Lamed means punishment, punishment. If you breach this wall, if you go to that woman, and in Hebrew culture, it's usually a married woman who's actually committing adultery, so that's the other problem. You're violating the marriage contract. That's usually what's happening. It's not usually a single woman that's just trying to survive, although it can mean that. But it's really talking about a married woman who's loose, who goes out and cheats on her husband for money. That's really what it's about. And it's prohibited. Right in the word, Chet, wall. You don't go past this. And if you do, you're going to be punished twice. Whoa. The other, that's 2490. The other one is 6498. Okay, and that one is, I think that's right. Yeah, Kadeshah. Kadeshah. And it's from another word, 6945, Kadosh, which means sodomite. So you could have a male prostitute, which is what that Zayin is about. Zayin identifies this as both man and woman. In other words, the new this I tell you, man, they know their sexual anatomy. Okay, this could be a male or a female, but it's definitely the same kind of thing. It's telling you what it is. It's the male, and if you know, the man has the phallus, right? So the Zayin, which is the sword, the erect sword, you got the illustration in your mind here. The Nun means travel, message, right? Not travel in the way the Gimel does, but a message transfer. Like in the word amen, it's a wing-speedy messenger, which symbolizes the Holy Ghost, okay? Amen, you're basically saying Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Nun is the winged speedy messenger, which is the Holy Ghost. In this word, it's meaning you take your Zayin, okay, and you send a message to this female, or it could be the other as well, as I've pointed out there. Anyway, you'll see that it's a misuse of that is basically what it is. And if you look at it in the context of where these words are used in the scriptures, you'll get a better feeling for that, okay? But sodomite, it's right there, right? I told you, right there. It's taken 6948, which is what this is taken from the word 6945, kadosh, which means sodomite, all right? Just so you know. And again, it's not between the men and the women. It's not the same thing. I mean, there's some issues there that you don't want to do probably, but I'm not going to talk about those, okay? I'm just not going to do it. So you can see that a concubine is nothing like a prostitute. Nothing like it. If you look at the word concubine, this is where we're going to go next, is we're going to break this down so that you can see really how beautiful this thing with concubines is. Now, a wife is usually referred to as an isha. There's some other words too, but Isha is usually, it means woman, and it's usually showing possessiveness by a man, okay? Beautiful thing. It's spelled Aleph Shin He. And I did a whole video on Isha sometime back in the religion series. I'm not going to repeat it here, but you can go look at it. But let's break these down. And it'll show you that this has to do with contracts. But they're not marriage contracts in that the wife has special rights, privileges, etc. These are less extensive, wrong word, extensive, or expansive. These are pretty limited. Like I said, it can be for a time. It could be that, okay, you get one house, but you don't get any more. If you have kids, they're mine. You can't take off with them unless I allow you to. And that was the situation between Abraham and Hagar, okay? But anyway, let's look at it. Pei, Yod, Lamed, Gimel, Shin. What this means is that by mouth, you are making a verbal agreement, okay? Lamed means there's a punishment if you go against this, but again, it's not at the marriage contract level. So you're making a verbal agreement, and it moves towards the shin, which is, it's the fire of life in the belly and all that. So it's saying, we have this agreement, but we're going to say, kids are going to have a special relationship here. So that's the first one. So if kids are coming into the marriage, you may agree that the woman can take them, or you may say, no, the husband gets them. So there are arrangements made right in the word to take care of that possibility of fruit from that relationship. But it's not a marriage, but it's perfectly okay to do this. Responsibility is the key. Like Abraham with Hagar, when Sarah said, send my handmaiden away with her son, I don't want her around my son. Abraham said, okay, yeah, I can see doing that. And he does, but he went and saw Hagar and Ishmael several times. It's even talked about. Okay. The other word, of course, is this one here on 3904, and that one is Lakena. And we get the same idea there. El means a law. There's a statutory thing that's set. You have a wall, all right, but you can alter it. You can move into and of course this has to do with the feminine anyway, the hay. But basically, what it's saying is the wall is penetrable if you do the right thing. Okay, she's not a prostitute. You're not paying her in the sense that, she's a married woman committing adultery against her husband, or that you're not just paying her just for the sex. All right? So that's kind of the idea that comes out in the word 3904. So you see their differences. And I don't have these up, but we have talked about prostitute, but let's talk about adultery. What is adultery? I don't have these up on the board, so you'll have to forgive me for this. And there's something else I was going to talk about there. Harlots and prostitutes and whores. There are different words for that, like we have here. We've already talked about those. You can look those up if you want. Let's move to, and I was going to talk about whoredom and actual adultery. These are violations of a marriage contract. Not sex between unmarried people, not even sex under biblical law with a man with a woman that he's not married to, as long as she's not married to somebody else. That's the issue in adultery in biblical law. But at any rate, and we see that also in the whole situation with the fall in the Garden of Eden, or from the Garden of Eden. But anyway, whoredom or adultery. There are several words here. I don't have them written down. I'm just going to give you the numbers so that you can look these up in Strong's and divide them down. Take those words, and if you understand the meanings of the different letters, break them down and see, and you work with them and see if you can see what they mean by breaking. And that's called notarikon, when you break the word down. For instance, this one here, you break it down to dalet, chet, vav, hey, and you say, well, dalet means door, chet is a wall, but the vav means it's joined to a woman. So in other words, it's saying this is a door where you can have contact with a woman that you'd normally be prohibited from. That's kind of the idea, all right? But you do it by contract. Now let's look at whoredom and adultery and all those. I'm just going to give you the words, and you go ahead and run with these. Whoredom, 2183, zanun, means adultery. 2181 from the same word. 8457, these are all in the Hebrew side of Strong's. Taznuth, which is from 2181. It means harlotry, idolatry. Fornication. Fornication doesn't necessarily, and it very rarely means sex between unmarried people. It actually means idolatry, or that you go to a prohibited nation. The Israelites weren't supposed to marry the other nations. They were supposed to intermarry with themselves, especially Levites. And we've talked about that before. So fornication is marrying somebody outside of your people. Or becoming disenchanted and pulling away, going astray, that kind of thing. Adultery. Word 5003. Noaf. Means a woman who breaks wedlock, and a man who assists in that. And that's why when they brought that woman to Jesus and they didn't have the man, even though they were found together, supposedly caught in the very act, they violated the law. So they can't stone the woman because they violated the law and not bringing the man there. So it's I guess you would say it's like the Brady law, right? You're not bringing forth evidence that proves innocence or guilt, so it's dismissed. 5003. 5004 is also basically the same word, just slightly different vowel-wise. Niyuf, another version of adultery. And I'll break these down for you so you kind of get why they are what they are. Adulterous, 5005, is na'afuf. These are spelled nun, aleph, pei, primarily, with the exception of 5005, na'af, which is nun, aleph, pei, vav, pei. Interesting. Very important. As I pointed out a long time ago, the way, when they say that a woman committed adultery, in Gesenius, not so much, but in Strong's, and I pointed this out many videos back, Strong's will try to say that woman means adulteress. No, it's always in a situation when that happens where there's something defining some woman's conduct. That doesn't make the woman an adulteress, or any woman adulteress. And I gave you all that information before. Basically, the word is isha, and it doesn't mean adulteress. But there are women that commit adultery, but Strong's was wrong in putting a woman as meaning adulteress. It doesn't. I showed you that man, ish, is used like hero, right? But not all men are heroes. So you see there's some real problems with the way Strong's has been used there. And I talked about that before. Look it up in the religion series. Okay, so we've shown what that is. What do we mean by na'af, niyuf, and na'afuf? Nun means, again, message. Aleph means God. Pay means mouth. Okay, so what you're doing here is you're basically circumventing God. You're circumventing the contract by mouth. It's really what it means. You're bypassing God with this message by mouth. There's no contract between the people that are committing the adultery. They are breaking a contract. Okay? All right, I think I've talked about everything there. By the way, whoredom again, 2183, which I don't have up here on prostitute. Whoredom 2183 is zanun. Again, it's zan, traveling to the noon. Okay, that's kind of the idea. The word noon, it's a message. Zanun, that you're breaking, you're slicing, you're destroying a covenant. Okay? And then there's some other aspects of that. Zenuth, which is word 2184, and Taznuth, which is 8457. All of those have to do with that. Okay, the breaking, the interference of or not undertaking the proper covenants, proper contracts, proper agreements. You can make her a concubine, but if it's only for sex and an exchange of money, no, that doesn't work. Fornication. Is fornication sex between unmarried people? Is that what it is? Not really. It can be under certain circumstances, but there are laws for that in Leviticus and elsewhere. And I've talked about those before. If a man lies with a woman and seed leaves him, they both have to go and wash their clothes. You know, basically it's a hygienic thing, and they're ritually unclean until even. There's no sin. Especially if it was one of these situations, a concubine, where there's been an arrangement. I'm not promoting promiscuity. What I'm saying is that the prudish attitudes of the Christians, for instance, in particular, and even some Jews and others, has gone too far. You just have to make arrangements for those children if they come along. All right? A lot of people are saying, Roy, you're just allowing people to just do anything they want. Well, let's see. God gave us free agency, right? It's how we use it. Let's look at fornication. Almost never is this used about individuals in the scriptures. It's almost in the Hebrew scriptures. It's almost, and even in the New Testament when it talks about fornication, it's usually talking about, like, adulteries. You're committing like I mentioned in one thing in James there, where he says, you adulterers and adulteresses. He's not saying that people are actually committing adultery. He's saying that they're going against God as, adulterers, as they're worshiping false gods, idols and things like that. That's what he's talking about, not their individual sexual behavior. I'm not saying that didn't apply too, but that's normally what it's about. So it's almost never used about individuals, but as Israel as a whole, or as a particular tribe, like the Judites as a whole, something like that. It really means being outside of your clan, your tribe, your nation. That's really what it means. And committing idolatry, worshiping other gods. That's usually how it's used. The idea is more, the real idea of fornication, which are words, I'm just going to give you the numbers here. 2181, these are all on Strong's Hebrew side. 8457, and basically, if you look those up, you'll see it kind of means more of straying off, becoming unattached, loss of interest, changing loyalty, being contrary. It hardly ever means, if ever, unmarried sex. The other commandment is that if a man humbles a maid, this is unmarried sex. If a man humbles a maid, okay, and all the other circumstances are there that require him, he either has to take her. Well, the way it says there is if they come up and without a previously made contract as a concubine, if they get together and they just lay in the hay somewhere together, okay, the law is, well, you can't even take her as a concubine. You have to take her as an isha, a wife, because you've humbled her. Now there are laws, there are statutes and all these things that show when people can end these relationships. Disloyalty, adultery for certain. If you lie about whether you're have ever married or not, there are all kinds of things that if you find out that there were lies or deceptions or frauds or betrayals, those are grounds for divorce. Yeah, Jesus said, divorce is bad, but he was talking about the divorce of the Herodians primarily. In other words, the serial polygamy, serial monogamy that they were using. Marry a wife, she thinks she's home and everything's going to be great, and then she's kicked out of the house. She didn't want it. Because Moses said, if you find something in her that you don't like, you can get rid of her. But he was specifically talking about betrayal, fraud, those type, or maybe some other things, but the point is you just can't throw women away. That's not it. And this law for concubinage shows that there are a lot of women that can't get married or don't want those restrictions on their rights, but they still want the man-woman relationship. God wasn't so prudish that he didn't fix that. And the hint of it, as I said before, is in the curse to Eve, when she said, now thy desire shall be thy husband and he shall rule over thee. What was it like before? Let's see. I think there were a couple of other things I wanted to bring up. We've already gone for, over an hour. How many of you have already left? So I don't want to listen to this guy. I don't like this subject, God has a much more broad application of free agency than the men who pretend to speak for him or think that they speak for him, because they use something that has been used and manipulated by other men. The secrets are in there. You just have to be able to be willing to search them out on your own. Love. Let's talk about love for a minute. What is love? There are several words, and I don't have these written up. I'm just going to tell you what they are. A lot of people say, well, agape and those types of love that we see in the New Testament only showed up in the New Testament covenant. No. They were in the Hebrew too. Let's look at some of them. Word 1730, dode. By the way, it's very similar to the name David. It's Dalet, Vav, Dalet, which is David's name. So David was love too. Yeah, I know the vowels are different, but those consonants give you the really central meaning of the word. And even God said, David is a man after my own heart. That's the thing about love. So dode, word 1730, it means to love, lover, especially love between the sexes. Then there's ohab, word 157, or ahaba, 160. Then there's word koshak, word 2836. And then amorous love, agaba, which I didn't write down here the number, but just to let you know that I'm familiar with those. Okay? All of those have to do with, like the word David there, heart. Ohab means a man or God with a woman in the house. Interesting, huh? Ahaba. Aleph, Hey, Bait. Husband in the house, in the house with a wife. Basically is what that means. Just some examples of taking the words apart by Notarikon. Okay, let's talk about one last thing here, and then I'll let you go. There's been an issue, and I saw that Dr. Michael Heiser talked about this as well. There's a scripture in Isaiah, and it talks about, everybody interprets it as being about the Messiah coming. And I'm not going to refute that here, because I won't. The types and shadows do recur, okay? One eternal round, nothing new under the sun, etc. I understand that. And what you can apply certain events in the past to things that are happening now, and Daniel is a good example of that. Okay, so in Isaiah it says that there will be this punishment, this persecution of this individual, and who shall declare his generation, for he is cut off from the land of the living. And then there's the word in Genesis where it talks about Noah being perfect in his generations. There's a reticence on the part of biblical scholars, especially ones who are traditionalist Christians or who have this problem with these extended family, familial and conjugal relationships. They don't want to go there, especially with any idea of Jesus having family, which would, and I mean children, which would have required him to be married, which I maintain that he had to be to fulfill all that was required of him. So we take the word generate, and the argument even by Michael Heiser is that there's a difference between genetics and age meaning time period. Okay, so the argument there is that these words are talking only about that like for Noah, he was perfect in his generations, meaning in his age, amongst the people that he was with, he was perfect. That's kind of how they get around any idea that maybe he had good genes. That God preserved those genes, which is really the purpose of the genealogies, right? Why have a genealogy if you're not concerned without, where you came from and the genes that you had? Now, they didn't know about genes, apparently. I'm not saying that they did, but the pedigree was definitely important. So it's not just about in their time. And the same thing would be true with when it talks about, there in Isaiah about, and in Psalms I think as well, Psalms in particular, that who shall declare his generation because he's cut off from the land of the living. Well, you can look at that two ways, and both of these apply. Who's going to talk about the age that he lived in? Because he's unknown now. He came into the world, he did this stuff, and he's cut off from the land of the living. Who's going to talk about him? Who's going to reveal who he really was? The people doing the miracle-working wonder tales in the Hellenized Jewish Hellenized world? Paul and the Romans changing it with Philo's help, as I've talked about in the past, to Hellenize the entire thing, to go against what James is talking about, and also the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I've explained all of that before. So they hid who he really was. It doesn't even say in those scriptures that it's from the Davidic line or the Judahite line. It just talks about his age, and that who's going to declare about his time and what really happened. But it also means his posterity. Dual meaning. Let's look at the words. The first one is door. Dalet Vav Resh. And it basically means time, age, and posterity. The other one is Toledo, and it's the same thing. And there'll be disagreements amongst the scholars because they don't want to get to the idea that it's not only about posterity, but the concept that would require a marriage or a contract with a concubine. So Jesus had posterity. And who he really was and what he really did has been nebulous. And who will declare the truth of the age that he lived in? It all fits. That's kind of rushing through it, but they say that the mind can only absorb what the seat can endure. So I don't want to take too much time. Let me grab some water here and I'll be right back. had that coffee, and now I'm kind of dried out a little bit. I will do a follow-up live stream. Oh, by the way, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, I put up a video this morning. Today, like I said, this is my second video today. People have been saying, I can't find your videos. They're gone. Where did they go? A whole bunch of them. I had a very good friend text me and say, what's happened? Why are they taking your stuff down? Well, YouTube does these things, and I explained it in the video before this one. Okay, well, yeah, the video before this one, because I recorded it as well. The live streams have been taken off the main video line and moved over to under the tab of live. So if you look at the top of like my YouTube channel here, right down there will say home, videos, live has been added there, community, about, all of those things. So all of the live streams have now been put under the heading for live. They could have removed some too. I'm not going to go back and see what they've done there, but that's where, if I do a live stream, that's where it is. So unless you are subscribed to me, you won't get the notifications of those live videos, live streams, and they won't be in the normal video lineup. You have to go to the live tab, click on that, and then all of those live streams will show up. YouTube likes to make things complicated. They don't like us talking about what we do, so they just make it in any way more difficult to stop access to people like myself. Up front, I thought I better tell you about that. If you need a little more information on it, look at the video prior to this one. On this, under the videos, they're basically all the recorded ones now. Okay, that are put up with recordings like this one. The live streams are all put under the live tab. All right, so I can't really show you that, but I think if you go look, you'll see what I'm talking about. So that's a problem. All right, and I bring that up because there are going to be a lot of questions about this, and I haven't done an exhaustive presentation. You know, I haven't gotten into all the vowel points and all these other things that can have impacts on that, because the consonants are really the important part of a word. They're the ones that help you take it apart. The minor variations are the vowels. Okay, and I recognize that. But the central point of the consonants really do, when you look into it, help you to understand the word better. For instance, the kava, these are the consonants, and you hear an sound here, da kava. So now what if it was dakovo? All right, it would be a different word. Just like in the English language, you know, we say read or read. Right. Well, that happens in the Hebrew too, and I'm aware of that. But this was no accident, and this had some other reason for using this for concubine. It's not musical instruments, as I've shown. It's not. Okay. So what am I saying? In addition to the live streams, I will do a live stream follow-up with this. We will do a Q&A on it on live. At some time the next few days, after you get a chance to digest some of this and look at it, and we'll talk about it in some more detail. God is much more magnanimous in our personal relationships than we understand. He does not go for same-sex relationships. I'm sorry, he doesn't, and there are extreme punishments for that. If nothing more than you get cut off from root and branch, you're not going to have kids. Adopting them is not going to do it for you. There's a slight difference with women. There's no overt commandment prohibiting closeness between women, but that's because there's no transmission of seed. All right. And women are naturally more affectionate, but when they cut themselves off from a male relationship, they're really destroying their purpose, their calling, and their blessings. So it's still not the best of circumstances. Now that might raise a question. We're getting into some adult conversation here. What about in your plural marriage relationships, Roy? Did the women have relationships with each other? I mean, close, intimate relationships? Not in my case. People say, well, how do you know? Because I knew the women. They just weren't up to that. In some plural marriage relationships that I'm aware of, the women are intimate. I'm not saying that's common. I'm not saying that. But I am aware of at least one situation where they told me that was the case. But the man was still there. It was still a family unit. Was that a good thing? I can't really comment on it. I would be very uncomfortable doing something like that. I'm really in that intimate relationship. I'm really into the one-on-one thing. I really don't want a spectator, there. Somebody else watching. I don't go there. Is it prohibited? No. Biblically, no. Some people might say, well, yeah, that's the definition of whoredom. No, it isn't. Not if it's done under a contractual situation. Whether a marriage or a concubinage, no, it's not. No, it's not. Sorry. So we will talk about all this on a follow-up live stream, on a Q&A. And I know this, like I said, this is going to stir up, for those who are really adamant about the way things have to be, this is going to stir up a lot. But you see, I don't care, right? I'm not worried about followers. I'm not worried about getting your money. I don't really care what you think, because I'm giving you an out. I'm saying you can look at this on your own and make your own decisions. I'm not looking for fame, or fortune, or to steal your soul. Quite to the contrary. Again, I want to open your mind so that you will see things that have been hidden from you. The miracles that Jesus wrought. The deaf shall hear, the blind shall see. I want you to see and hear. Do with it as you will. Keep your eyes on the horizon, your ears to the ground, situational awareness on high. We can talk about all the politics and the horrible things that are going on in the United States and around the world. Ukraine, all that, all that. That's not the purpose of this video. But at the end, I have to say, CYA, watch yourselves. Be careful. There are forces out there that want to destroy all of you. Subjugate you and then destroy you. So keep your eyes on the horizon, ears to the ground, situational awareness on high. Prep, pray, stay out of the way as best you can. Remember, holiness means separate. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're, down on your knees and pious and, all that. No, it means separate. It means get out of Babylon as best you can in every possible way you can. All right? Okay. That's all for today. I want to thank you for coming. I'm sure I disturbed a lot of people with this. But sometimes that's necessary, especially as far down the road with the destruction of the man-woman relationship as we've seen since Azazel or whoever that was came into the Garden of Eden and screwed up the first family. Out here. Take care.